Welcome to The Explainer. So this is week 1 of our Romans 8 project. We're taking the core message straight from this week's Korean sermon manuscript and breaking it down, really unpacking it, so our English-speaking congregation can grab hold of these incredible, life-changing truths and actually apply them to daily life. You know, if you've ever just felt totally weighed down by this constant, nagging sense of spiritual inadequacy, or maybe you find yourself stuck in that exhausting cycle of trying really hard, failing, and then feeling incredibly guilty, well, you are in the exact right place. We're going to look at a truth from the source material today that literally has the power to completely flip how you view yourself, how you see God, and how you live out your faith every single day. Let's get into it and see how we can finally break free from all that weight.
This one single sentence is absolutely the bedrock for everything we're talking about today. Romans 8:1. It says, "Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." The source material actually points out that this verse is the root of Romans 8. It's the very foundation of the Christian faith. And yeah, it sounds beautiful, right? But to really truly grasp how massive this is, we can't just skim over it. We've got to dig into the exact words Paul is using here, because he is using some highly specific language to show us a permanent change in our status.
Let's look at this word right here, condemnation. I think a lot of times we mistakenly equate condemnation with just, feeling bad about ourselves after we mess up. But as the source explains, this is a strict legal courtroom term. When a judge bangs the gavel and hands down a terminal, guilty verdict, literally a death sentence, that is condemnation. It's an absolute legal standing before a judge. It's not just a psychological emotion or some fleeting feeling of guilt. The stakes here, they are literally life and death.
To fully appreciate what Paul is saying here, try reading the verse backward. It's wild. If being in Christ means no condemnation, then the inverse is also brutally true. Outside of Christ, there is absolute condemnation. It didn't matter if you tried your hardest to live a good life, or kept all the rules, or gave to charity. Outside of Christ, the terminal verdict was always guilty. But then, we see this jarring reality of grace. Even if you stumble, even if you mess up, because you are in Christ, the judge looks at you, sees Jesus, and declares not guilty. It's this stark, absolute shift in your legal standing based entirely on your position.
Now, you might be wondering, and it's a totally natural tension to feel here, if our position is completely secure and we can never ever be condemned, does that just mean we can do whatever we want? Like, if we're immune to the punishment, can we just live completely carelessly? The source notes that this is exactly the kind of question people ask when they think grace is, kind of unfair. It's like those juvenile offenders who know they won't face adult penalties, so they just act recklessly. Are Christians supposed to act like spiritual juvenile offenders?
The answer to that is a massive, resounding no. Listen, grace is not some clever legal loophole. The source points out that if someone uses no condemnation as an excuse to just chase their own selfish desires and live recklessly, they have completely missed the sheer awe of the cross. They just don't get the deep emotion and the immense cost of the gospel yet. This verse isn't about what you're suddenly allowed to get away with. It's entirely about what God has accomplished on your behalf.
Section 1. The universal inner struggle.
So before Paul gave us that triumphant promise in Romans 8, he actually bared his soul about his own struggle back in Romans 7. Just listen to his brutal honesty here. "For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing." I mean, Paul wasn't flawless. He faced the exact same intense inner conflict that we all do. We wake up, we want to be patient, we want to love our spouses and our neighbors, and yet, at the very first sign of irritation, we find anger and resentment just bubbling up. We really want to do good, but we end up doing the exact things we hate.
And this inner conflict leads Paul to just cry out in deep anguish. He says, "What a wretched man I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death?" You can literally hear the crushing weight of his spiritual frustration. It's palpable. He realizes that trying to achieve perfect goodness on his own, it's entirely impossible. His own flesh, his own inner nature, is just constantly betraying his desire to follow God's law.
Section 2. The clean room of holiness.
To really understand why this inner struggle with seemingly small sins is actually a massive problem, the sermon gives us this super vivid, modern analogy. Picture a semiconductor factory where they make those tiny microchips. The workers have to wear these full-body, hazmat-style suits and pass through air showers just to get inside the clean room. Why? Because one single microscopic speck of dust on a silicon wafer will completely ruin the microchip. In that pristine environment, the human being itself is the literal source of contamination.
The source material explains that God's holiness is exactly like that clean room. One microscopic speck of sin simply cannot exist in the absolute purity of God's presence. In the clean room of God's holiness, our sinful nature is the contamination. And that one speck? That's what warrants the terminal verdict of condemnation. 4,000. That's roughly the number of years of biblical history from creation right up until the arrival of Jesus. The source asks a really profound question here. Why did God wait so long? Well, because those 4,000 years, which were filled with giving the law and sending all those prophets, they proved definitively that human beings simply cannot keep God's law. Our inner nature is fundamentally contaminated by the law of sin and death. The flesh is just way too weak.
Section 3. God condemned sin itself.
But right when the tension of our human failure hits its absolute peak, the narrative totally shifts. Here is the crucial point. God didn't condemn you. God condemned sin. The source highlights this profound theological truth from Romans 8:3. God sent his own Son, Jesus, in the likeness of sinful flesh. And in that flesh, God poured out the terminal courtroom verdict, the actual condemnation on sin itself. He banged the gavel, declared guilty, and passed the death sentence onto sin, permanently shifting the punishment away from us. God stepped in and did for us what we could absolutely never do for ourselves.
And because of this, the governing principles of our lives have entirely changed. We are no longer under the law of sin and death. That's the old principle that dominates human nature and drags us down to terminal punishment, kind of like gravity pulling you down. Instead, for those in Christ, we are now completely governed by a new ruling power, the law of the Spirit of life. This new law totally overrides the old one and brings true freedom. You see, you aren't made righteous because you acted perfectly. You're righteous because God condemned sin in Christ and clothed you in his perfect righteousness.
Section 4. Love-driven, not fear-driven. So what does this all mean for us, say on a random Tuesday morning? How does this grand, theological courtroom reality actually change our everyday lives? This sermon draws a massive distinction in how we apply this. On the outside, two Christians might look totally identical, right? They're both praying, both serving, both obeying. But internally, one might be serving just to earn acceptance through fear. They're terrified of being abandoned by God. That is living under the fear of condemnation. But the other person, who's been transformed by the gospel, is serving because they are already accepted. They are acting out of the joyful assurance of God's love. One is driven by this exhausting anxiety of, I have to do this so God won't reject me. The other is driven by the total peace of, God has already accepted me, so I joyfully choose to do this.
If you want to break that endless cycle of guilt, the source outlines some really practical steps. First, you have to stop staring at your past failures and your deep wounds. Second, stop looking inward for spiritual perfection. The sermon actually uses this brilliant imagery of a patient in an emergency room just constantly gasping for air, begging God to save them over and over again. I mean, that's exhausting. Instead, look outward at what God has already done. When you fall, don't condemn yourself, because God hasn't condemned you. Cling to that verdict of no condemnation. Let your failures remind you of how desperately you needed grace, and then let them fuel a deep, deep gratitude that God actually provided it.
Which brings us to our final thought. I really want to leave you with this lingering question to reflect on. Are you living to earn God's love, or are you living because you already have it? When you truly, deeply grasp that there is no condemnation for you in Christ Jesus, that exhausting cycle of earning and failing, it finally stops. You can just rest. You can breathe. Let this truth sink in. Let it transform your motives, and let it empower you to live fueled by radical love rather than crippling fear. Thank you so much for joining this explainer for Week 1 of the Romans 8 Project. We really hope this helps our English-speaking congregation take the heart of this Korean sermon into your week and live in absolute true freedom.